Oh, fuck, it's been 20 years since 9/11 happened, and today is the 20-year anniversary of it. Um, but going from 9/11 to what happened on January 6th, what is the difference? What is the differing opinion on what terrorism would look like for certain people? The definition of terrorism is, in theory, not that difficult to understand, but the Code of Federal Regulations defines terrorism as the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce your government, the civilian population or any segment thereof, and furtherance of political or social objectives. The FBI further teases this out by defining domestic terrorism as motivated by a desire to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences, and international terrorism committed by those inspired by or associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations or nations. So terrorism is violence, usually of the showily public sort, committed to achieve a political end. It's really that fucking simple. And yet, getting people to agree to a definition of terrorism has been notoriously difficult. Has been a notoriously difficult event, in the best of times. After 9/11, the situation became impossible. Conservatives have spent the past 2 decades successfully bullying anyone who pointed out that the category terrorist encompassed a lot more people than Islamic fundamentalists violently striking out against the Western institutions. The result, 20 years after the events of 9/11, is the current situation in the U.S. The same Republicans who started the war on terror and spent years defending the indefensible foreign policy on the grounds of homeland security have, under Donald Trump's squatting, organized themselves around coddling and minimizing the much more they minimized the much more pressing threat of the domestic terrorism. After the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, which was absolutely a terrorist attack by any reasonable definition, the Republicans are more committed than ever to turning a blind eye to terrorism and allowing the violent extremists to control American politics. It's arguable that for conservatives, this is just a return to the historical status quo. Most terrorism in American history has been committed by the homegrown radicals who are motivated by white supremacy, meaning Trump sycophants, Christian fundamentalism, or other far-right ideologies. That was true in the late 19th century when President Ulysses S. Grant unleashed the newly formed Department of Justice to shut down the KKK, which at the time was the terrorism arm of a larger movement to force the formerly enslaved people back into second-class citizen status. It was also true in the various periods of American history, such as the 1920s and 30s, when the mass lynching became a tool for the white supremacists to kneecap the black economic empowerment. Critically, it was just true in the decade before the 9/11 attacks, which bore witness to a rise of racist and Christian fundamentalist terrorism, including the targeted shootings of abortion doctors. One of the most famous terrorists in the 1990s was a guy named Eric Rudolph, who was a Christian fundamentalist who bombed abortion clinics. He had bombed a lesbian bar in the Atlantic, and he was also responsible for the bombing of the Atlanta Olympics of 1996, all in protest of what he saw as evil progressive values. Another one was Timothy McVeigh, who was a white supremacist who bombed the Oklahoma City Federal Building, killing 168 people. 19 of them were children at the building's daycare, in a strike against what he saw as a democratic federal government. Now, the logic driving McVeigh and Rudolph that vigilantes should be able to force the right-wing views on a public that rejected them democratically, and it's becoming the standard operating logic of the Republican Party. We see this in the GOP cover-up of Trump's January 6th insurrection. We also see this in the new abortion ban in Texas, which bypasses law enforcement altogether, and then empowers the self-appointed bounty hunters to chase down anyone suspected of helping women abort their pregnancies. After 9/11 happened, there was an effective campaign on the right to erase this extensive history of the right-wing violence from the American conception of terrorism. George W. Bush, who was the president then, leaned heavily into using terror as a vague word connecting Islam and violence. But the war on terror was used as a cover to invade Iraq, a sovereign nation, and deposed the Islamic president, even though there was no connection of Iraq or Saddam Hussein to 9/11. But Bush's defenders would also pretend like his leadership protected Americans from terrorism, even though Bush's own FBI record multiple incidents of domestic terrorism linked to American politics, including the white supremacy and anti-choice movements. It was It was also so bad that the right was able to bully Barack Obama's administration into ignoring that homegrown right-wing terrorism is still terrorism. Back in 2009, the Department of Homeland Security issued a memo had warning that the right-wing extremists will attempt to recruit and radicalize returning veterans. It wasn't a fucking surprise observation, though. Just such recruitment is how McVeigh, the most famous terrorist of the 90s, got radicalized. The Republicans nonetheless went full tilt into faking their outrage, using the honor of the vets cover for what was clearly a campaign to conceal a very real terrorist threat emanating from their extremist right wing. Unfortunately, the administration caved and withdrew the report, which turned out to be incredibly accurate, as 1 in 5 people who were arrested for participating in January 6th, the January 6th insurrection were veterans. Distorting the word terrorism to make it a Muslim-only thing served not just the racist purposes of the right, but their own political agenda. The sad fact of the matter is that terrorism works. That is true of how 9/11, which functioned exactly how Osama bin Laden wanted it to, by provoking an American overreaction that would radicalize young Muslims into his holy war, and it's true stateside, as demonstrated by the way the mainstream anti-choice movement works in tandem with terrorists to scare the doctors away from providing abortion, a relationship which became even more explicit after the Texas ban. The January 6th insurrection proves this unfortunate truth once again, as evidenced by the Republicans who have stuck by Trump and denied the seriousness of the terrorist attack that he incited. Running cover for the domestic terrorists pays political dividends for Republicans, as those folks are using violence to achieve the conservative political ends that more peaceful legislative means cannot. Trump had what you might call a friendly relationship to the terrorist impulse from the very beginning. Trump's unsubtle winking and nodding to white supremacist terrorism started early during his campaign in August of 2015 when he praised 2 sycophants who beat up a Mexican-American man by calling them passionate and saying that they loved his country. He proceeded to escalate for years, most infamously when he called the neo-Nazis rioters very fine people in 2017 and culminating on January 6th when he incited the assault on the Capitol. It is true that in the face of the rising white supremacist terrorist acts like the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018, or the El Paso Walmart shootout of 2019, all of those attacks were linked to a racist rhetoric that Trump and his sycophants routinely espoused. It became harder and harder to pretend that the white supremacist terrorism wasn't the real thing that was killing real people. Even Trump's appointed FBI director, Christopher Wray, admitted to Congress in 2019 that a majority of the domestic terrorism cases were investigated and are motivated by some version of what you might call the white supremacist violence. Despite all this, the Republicans have stood by Trump and refused to admit that what he was unleashing on the U.S. fits the definition of terrorism. On the contrary, the Republicans have only doubled down on equating the word terrorism with that single strain of political violence committed by the Islamic extremists. Even worse, many conservative pundits and Republican politicians have become even more freer than they were during the Bush administration, and conflating all the Muslims everywhere with terrorists, which is the equivalent of saying that all Christians are terrorists because of Eric Rudolph. We see this in the demagoguery of around the mission of Afghanistan of the Afghan refugees to the U.S. after the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, which Republican politicians and faux news pundits have routinely equated with allowing. As House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican from California, said, terrorists are coming across the border. And this is the same McCarthy who tried to block the investigation of the January 6th attack and who continues to butt-fuck Trump, the man who instigated the whole thing. It makes a grim sort of sense that Republicans are growing increasingly anti-democratic. They can't win people over by persuasion, and so they turn to blunt force in order to get their way. The GOP increasingly leans on the same logic as terrorists. That's why their anti-voting laws have echoes of the Jim Crow laws that were coupled with racist terrorism in the past, and that's why their new abortion law relies on the right-wing vigilantism. As Mother Jones recently released an important video of the reporter Becca Andrews connecting the Texas law to the Capitol insurrection and right-wing militias, all rooted in a terroristic approach to gaining power. In an atmosphere of what pundits delicately call the political polarization, it's an open question of whether the word terrorism can be meaningful used anymore. A huge bulk of the American terrorism is related to the Republican Party, and not just because the domestic terrorists and Republican politicians have the same general policy platform. We literally experienced a terrorist attack meant to gain the White House for a Republican who rightfully lost the election, but the American conception of terrorism has always been one of fringe actors lashing out against the powerful, but not as a support system to help the powerful gain more power. But it's been 20 years since 9/11, but it's still an open question as to whether we can update our image of terrorism to encompass what it really looked like back in 2021. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RVW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.